All right, let's get started. I want to welcome everybody today to the Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting. Today's a committee day. It's May 27th, 2013. My name is Jeff McMillan, and I'm the chairman. We'll start off our meeting with asking Miss Barber to do a roll call, please.
Jim Bledsoe.
Here.
Harold Cannon.
Here.
Bill Cox.
Here.
Jeff Griggs.
Here.
Jeff McMillan.
Here.
Tom Rice.
Here.
Jim Ripley.
Here.
Julie Schuster.
Here.
Clayton Stout. James Stroud.
Here.
Trey Teague.
Here.
Jamie Woodson.
Thank you. I made a mistake. It's June 27th. It's not May. I apologize. Director Carter, would you like to address us?
Thank you, Chairman McMillan. Living in the past can be good. That's okay. Well, thank you all for being here today. Commissioner McMillan will go through a series of how we're going to conduct the meeting today, and I won't be redundant in saying all the things that he's going to say. This will remind the audience, for folks that aren't used to being here, that we have a two-day meeting. The first day is what we call committee meetings, and the committee meetings are those days when things are taken up by the individual committees within the commission, and there are different ones. There's the wildlife, the fisheries, and so forth. And at that particular time, that will be the topics discussed, and the chairman of that committee will be the person that's going through the items that are on that particular committee's agenda. Also, would just like to say that, well, I'm going to stray off for just a second. When I saw this many people here earlier, I thought, it reminds me of, I had a presentation I was doing several years ago, and they allowed us to use the courthouse in this little county. I went to the courthouse and we set up everything and we got everything ready, and there was probably 125, 130 people in the room. I was so excited that many people had come to be a part of that meeting. I was about 2 minutes into my presentation, and this guy stuck his head in the door and said, "Everybody's here for the driving under the influence. It's 2 doors down." We had 5 people left after. So anyway, that's off the subject, but in any case, thank you all for being here to be a part of this, and the chairman will tell you in a second how he wants to conduct the meeting in terms of making comments. But the last thing I'll mention is that on committee day, there are no formal votes taken by the entire commission. That occurs on the next day, on Friday, which is the business meeting. And as far as the waterfowl seasons, this is very similar to what we do in our fisheries or wildlife or anything else when we're going through a series of things that's going to be up. We want public review and public input, so the things that we talk about today on the way to waterfowl seasons won't actually be voted on until August, so there won't be any official action taken at this meeting on any of the proposals. These are just to lay out where we are, what kind of items we have to bring before us and for public comment, and then we'll go from there. So, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Carter. Are any of the commissioners, if anybody has anything they want to discuss? If not, we'll get started. I want to welcome our guest, and I know that I see that the sign-in sheets being passed around. I hope that everyone that is a guest will please sign it, and specifically if you want to address the commission, we ask that you do it at the time that would be pertinent to the subject that we're discussing. I do reserve the right to, if things become redundant, to maybe limit it, but I would ask all of you to please come to the mic and address your name and who you represent, and then we'll go from there. But I do ask also that you address your questions to the commission. I want to add one person to our agenda. I left it off mistakenly, and that is Mr. Mike Butler, who is with Tennessee Wildlife Federation, and we will put him after Ms. Melinda Welton from the TOS Conservation Policy Committee. So unless there's any questions or comments, we'll get going, and we're going to start off with the Wildlife Management Committee and Chairman Trey Teague.
Thank you, Chairman McMillan. My name is Trey Teague. I'm chair of the Wildlife Management Committee, and at this time I'd like to introduce Director Carter.
Thank you, Chairman Teague. One of the topics that's on the agenda for discussion today revolves around sandhill cranes and what people in Tennessee know about them, what they feel about the possible hunting season, and the person that we hired to do the survey across the state to gain as much information as we could on a statistically valid type survey as opposed to just particular public input was a fellow by the name of Mark Duda. And several years ago in my career, I knew Mark back then and watched him develop in terms of his business and his expertise across the country, and he's very much involved in surveying methods on any number of wildlife issues, which is his expertise across the United States. I also tell you he has some Tennessee ties. His first, I guess you would call it, real job was working up in the Smoky Mountains National Park, and he's also worked around some of the state parks in there. He has family ties in Tennessee, so he's certainly no stranger to the people in Tennessee or some of our traditions and some of our things that we would call norms. But in any case, I've known Mark a long time, as I said, and I'm very glad that he was able to do this for us. A lot of the things that we do are through the University of Tennessee, and the reason we went outside the university to go with Mark on this one is because, again, of his expertise in a nationwide surveying, and we asked him to apply those techniques in Tennessee, and that's what he's done. So with that little bit of introduction, I would like to read you a more formal introduction just to tell you a bit more about Mark. Mark Damian Duda is the Executive Director of the Responsive Management, a survey research firm that specializes in natural resource and outdoor recreation issues. Mark's managed almost 1,000 research projects on how the public relates to natural resources and is the author of 4 books on wildlife and outdoor recreation, including the recently released The Sportsman's Voice, Hunting and Fishing in America. He's published more than 100 technical and popular publications, and his research has been featured in most of the major media, including CNN, National Public Radio, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and on the front pages of the Washington Post and the USA Today. Mark holds a master's degree from Yale University in Natural Resources Policy and Planning. I'm really glad that he was able to make it here today to talk about how the survey was put together and the findings that he had. So Mark, if you would, please.
Good afternoon. It always makes you a little bit nervous when you know somebody so well who introduces you, because you go back a long way and you're always nervous that they're going to tell a story that they know about you or something. So thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. Got about 20 minutes of presentation, and then I guess we're going to open it up for questions and answers and stuff. So good afternoon. Thank you, Director Carter, Chairman McMillan, and Commissioners. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk from a PowerPoint slide here. Hopefully everything works. And sort of give an overview in terms of how Tennessee residents think and feel and what they know about sandhill cranes. So I'd like to start off with the founder of modern wildlife management, Aldo Leopold. And back in 1943, he wrote that the problem of wildlife management is not how we should handle the deer, the wildlife. The real problem is one of human management. Wildlife management is comparatively easy. Human management is difficult. And that probably rings a lot more true now than it did in 1943 about the importance of the human dimension. And if we really go back to what Fish and Wildlife Management is all about, we talk about sort of fish and wildlife professionals here, us, and we really deal with 3 different aspects of fish and wildlife management. We deal with populations of wildlife, we deal with habitats, and we deal with people. And as a sort of human dimensions researcher over the past 25 years, I like to point out to the wildlife professionals that understanding people in that same scientific, deliberate, and orderly process that we understand fish and wildlife applies here as well. That is, that we apply scientific techniques to better understand how people think about wildlife issues. So it's sort of this realm that we're dealing with today and that I've been dealing with for a little while. The name of my organization is Responsive Management. Responsive Management was actually started by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies back in 1985, and they turned it over to me as a private entity in 1990. So we've been surveying the public literally around the world in most of the states, actually for every single state fish and wildlife agency over the past 23 years. So we've done work for every state agency, the Fish and Wildlife Agency, most of the departments of natural resources, and then a lot of the private conservation organizations, Ducks Unlimited, Turkey Federation, Rocky Mountain Elk. Then we also do work for a lot of the nation's universities. They hire us for data collection, much like you did today. We're currently doing a project with Stanford University, Colorado State, and Rutgers University. So a lot of sort of orientation on that side. So let's talk about this study in general. And I want to tell you a little bit about methodology. There might be a lot of questions about that, and we have time for that, I'm sure, afterwards. It's a very new study. We conducted this study in April of 2013, so only a few months ago. We completed 1,200 surveys, and we conducted those with residents as a whole, general population residents as a whole, Tennessee residents 18 years and older. We also did subsamples of those residents who live in the Hunt area, and then also hunters as a whole. And we were provided the license sample from Tennessee Wildlife on that. We work at something called a 95% confidence interval. And what we did is that we didn't want to know just what Tennessee residents thought of as a whole, but these different groups. The residents as a whole, residents of the Hunt area, hunters in the state as a whole, hunters who reside in the Hunt area, and then also wildlife watchers and birders in the state as a whole, and birders who live in the state as well as in the Hunt area. So we talked to a lot of people. The thing that I want to talk about is, because I get asked this a lot, well, do surveys really reflect what's really out there? How can you do 800 surveys and talk to that many people and say that that equals all of Tennessee residents, the thousands and millions of people who live in the state? Well, it's pretty easy after this past presidential election, because those who do this type of work were able to look at the very high quality surveys, the surveys that much like we did here, and the methodology that we use, the exact methodology, and were able to predict the presidential election this past year down to the electoral vote, down to the electoral vote. And some of these surveys were only 800, 900 people, either in each state, representative state, or across the U.S. We've also used a similar methodology to predict elections such as ballot initiatives. We've worked on a lot of right to hunt and fish issues and things like that. So a little bit in terms of the methodology, and I'd be glad to answer any specific questions that you have, because if you're not familiar with that kind of work, sometimes people have questions, and they're going to be good questions. So in terms of what we did, this was a pretty big study. We asked Tennessee residents, hunters, wildlife watchers, birders, a lot of questions about cranes, about sandhill cranes. We asked them about some of the things that they watch. What species do the birders watch? What species do the hunters hunt? We wanted to know about their knowledge levels, how much they know, how much they were familiar with sandhill cranes. We wanted to put in place the idea of hunting sandhill cranes in general with approval or disapproval of hunting in general within Tennessee. We looked at some recreational conflicts, and then we also asked some questions about the Crane Festival, lots of other stuff. So who did we talk to? We talked to a very representative sample of Tennessee residents. Half of those residents were male and half of them were female. And again, very nice representation in terms of the Hunt area, as well as hunters as a whole. This one that sticks out here is that we know generally about 9 out of 10 hunters are male. And so that again is very nicely represented. You'll also see that from hunters and birders that there's also a pretty even split among gender among your birders and your wildlife watchers, about 50-50. So age was the same in terms of that representation. It matched the Bureau of the Census numbers quite closely in terms of who we talked to. So we feel pretty comfortable that this represents what's out there. And what we do is we match what we did to the Bureau of the Census in terms of what they say is out there. The one that sticks out here is the, point up to that one, those are hunters in the Hunt area. We didn't have a lot of those people, but it tended to be a little bit older than the average individual. So what did we find? Let's take a look in terms of the big, broad overview of what it is that we saw. First off, we saw a very low level of awareness in terms of people who had seen sandhill cranes, people who were aware of sandhill cranes. While everybody in this room sort of lives and breathes wildlife, a lot of Tennessee residents don't. They have other things that they do, other things that they're interested in. In fact, only 41% of the state's residents had never heard of sandhill cranes before. So there's more people out there that haven't heard about sandhill cranes, anything, than have heard about them. 59%, only 59% of those in the Hunt area had ever heard of cranes. And you can see on it grows a little bit in terms of hunters in the hunt area. In terms of their knowledge levels, oh, point with this, okay. Let's see if that works. We also saw fairly low knowledge levels. We asked things about whether they could identify cranes, but also in terms, do they understand the difference in are the two birds like a great blue heron the same thing as a sandhill crane? So we tried to get some identification going. And only 10% of the public was absolutely sure that the sandhill crane and a great blue heron were different species. So we're dealing with relatively low knowledge levels. About 35% said, yeah, I think they're different species. 22% of hunters and 11% of wildlife watchers statewide said it was absolutely false. That is that they were the same species. So again, pretty low knowledge levels. 5% of the general population statewide, 12% of residents, 19% of hunters thought that sandhill cranes were increasing, which means the rest of the population said they didn't know, because a lot of people just flat out said they don't know what the populations are doing, or they said they were declining or they were endangered. And of course, that's going to impact people's attitudes as well. And then finally, we wanted to know if they knew where sandhill cranes were. And again, sort of in the single digits, the teens, in terms of people saying specifically where cranes were. So overall, we're dealing with some pretty low knowledge levels out there about sandhill cranes. That transfers certainly to little direct experience, whether people had seen one. About 28%, about a quarter of Tennessee residents have seen a sandhill crane. 45% of those who live in the hunt area have seen one, and about 56% of the wildlife watchers or the birders have seen one in the hunt area. So just a little bit more than half. In terms of support now, because one of the things that we were asked on this study was, do Tennessee residents support hunting? Do they support hunting for sandhill cranes? So we wanted to put this in context. We actually are just releasing a study. We've been monitoring Americans' attitudes toward hunting for about the past 25 years. And nationwide, the number runs at about 79%. About 79% of Americans support hunting in general. Now that starts to do different things as you talk about different species, the motivations for hunting, and other issues. But in terms of that, to put that in context. So I'm going to show you here each of those subgroups. We're not going to do that for all of them, but this one I thought it was important. So when we asked in general, do you approve or disapprove of legal hunting? This is Tennessee residents as a whole. More than 8 out of 10 support hunting or approve of hunting, 84%. So higher than the national average. In terms of the hunt area residents, people who live within those area that we were given by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, about 80%. In terms of hunters statewide, almost 100%, 99.5% said they approved. We actually had a couple people who said they didn't. And people go, well, that must be wrong, you know. But in looking at that over the years we've had this, there are people who have hunted who no longer support hunting, but had a license. These are licensed hunters. We actually have seen anti-hunters buy hunting licenses sort of as a way to save a deer or something. We've heard that. We also have general population people who buy a license to support the agency. And those people could be in that hunting license area. So if you see something like this, it's like, well, that should be 100%. Sometimes that's not true because these are representative of licensed hunters. In terms of the hunt area hunters, that's a very small N value. You did have a couple people out of that who said they moderately disapproved. Again, for probably those reasons. We didn't go into that on this study, but just from past work that we've done. Okay, so these are the wildlife watchers or the birders in the state. You're still getting about 86% approving of legal hunting. The hunt area wildlife viewers, again, 83%. These are all within that sort of area of 80 to 85%. Now, you're going to see that changes pretty dramatically when you go from hunting in general to hunting for sandhill cranes. Let's take a look at the Tennessee public. 19% of Tennessee residents supported hunting sandhill cranes, and 62% disapprove. So you can see almost a complete shift. That's the general population. 20% for the hunt area residents, that is the general population who live within that hunt area. Hunters statewide, this may be a little bit surprising, that is that not a majority of hunters supported hunting sandhill cranes at 42%, 35% opposing. In terms of the hunt area hunters, about 44% either supported strongly or moderately hunting for sandhill cranes. 21% of the wildlife viewers statewide supported hunting sandhill cranes. 24% of those birders and wildlife viewers within the proposed hunt area, the area that you're thinking about in terms of supporting versus 57% opposing hunting sandhill cranes. So we're sort of moving along from hunting in general to hunting sandhill cranes. But then we were asked by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, by the Tennessee Ornithological Society, and a number of other people who were involved in the development of the study. We didn't just go sort of in a cave and develop this study and come out. There was a lot of people involved in this study and a lot of people who vetted it before we actually brought it out. People who were for it, people who were against it. And so what we did is we included all of their points, and some people said, well, if people only knew this, then they would support hunting for cranes. And other people said, well, if they only knew this, they would oppose hunting for cranes. And so what we did is we wanted to build that in, because that's true. People make opinions and form their attitudes based on knowledge. And we saw there was very low knowledge. And so what we did is we worked with both of those groups of people, actually, in terms of people who didn't want to see it happen, people who did it, said it did, and other neutral people like us, to develop a survey that would indeed reflect giving people that information now. And so what we did is we had questions that would tend, you would think, to increase support, and then questions that would tend toward increasing opposition. And in order to have no bias there, what we did is we randomized both those sections, those big sections, as well as within those sections. So does that make sense? We didn't want to say, well, there's everything you should oppose or everything that support. They were randomized. So every person who got this actually got a different order. And so we felt comfortable with that. So the question is then, well, what messages work? What influences people's attitudes toward crane hunting? Well, in general, one of the things we saw is that once people started getting information, even statements that were encouraging opposition actually increased support a little bit. Some cases more than others, but I thought that was interesting. We're still trying to figure out why that's the case. But it didn't quite work exactly like we thought. The questions that we'd say that people said we were asked to put in there in the statements, you would think would increase opposition, and actually had the opposite effect. I'm not sure why that is. But in general, opposition was higher only for some of the statements encouraging that opposition. And let's take a look now at some of those statements. So in terms of those individuals who were interested in increasing support for hunting, these are the messages that most resonated with Tennessee residents in all of those different groups. That sandhill cranes have been involved in crop damage. That the estimated number of sandhill cranes has actually more than doubled since 1996. That sandhill crane hunting has occurred long-term in other states without negative impacts on populations, and that a limited number of permits would be made available. Those are the things that, when we made those statements, that increased support. Now, this is the other side of the coin in terms of those statements that would increase opposition. Does that make sense? Because at first people got confused when I was talking to them about that today. So we had questions, and we said, does this, if you knew this, would that, what would your opinion be on support or opposition to the hunting of cranes? How about this? How about this? How about this? And some made that more increase in support, some made more increase in opposition. So the ones that threw people into the more opposition were these two statements out of the four statements in this case that we read. That there might be confusion between whooping cranes and sandhill cranes, and that some wildlife watching and bird watching groups oppose the hunting of sandhill cranes. The interesting thing, again, is that support increased even with several reasons not to hunt sandhill cranes. Again, we're trying to figure that out sort of as we speak on why that was the case, but it was the case. So now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to give you much on this because there's a lot here, but I want to show you sort of all of these in this very easy to read graph. That what we did is we plotted to get to these conclusions. They weren't asked in this order, but you can see I wanted to give you sort of the relativeness in terms of the support. So these are the percentages. You saw those lower percentages at first. With the information, this is what increased Tennessee residents from strongly and moderately supporting hunting. And you can see those very things that I just talked about are on the top. So that's the general population. So what I would do is just focus your attention on sort of these numbers here. Even with all of those statements read, you're up to just a small majority at 52% supporting the hunting of cranes after they were read, all of these statements to increase support for hunting of cranes. This is the hunt area residents. Again, the same, it's small up there. But I wanted to show you again that in this case, in the hunt area residents, we did not reach a majority after all of those statements. These are hunters statewide. You saw those numbers that we did in terms of hunters with no information, and then you're getting up to about 76%, 73% with hunters statewide in terms of supporting hunting. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention again to the opposite, those statements that increased or were meant to increase opposition, or at least when we were given those that we thought that was be the case. So this is, you can see again, the opposition, this is both strong and moderate opposition, increases to 67% among the general population. That is the way you can read that is 67% of Tennessee residents opposed the hunting of sandhill cranes after they were read those negative statements, in terms, or at least those that were meant to elicit, that we thought would elicit an increase in opposition. And then on down the line, that some wildlife watching and bird watching groups, such as the Tennessee Ornithological Society, oppose sandhill crane huntings. And we did that for each one. Again, I don't think it's really important right now, but I wanted to show you the percentage, the higher percentages of strong and moderate opposition. Those are hunters statewide, and then I think we have wildlife watchers statewide. Just look at the actual number there, and then hunt area wildlife watchers. So we saw some pretty interesting things when it came to sort of shifting on those attitudes. And then finally, we asked some other questions. It's a pretty big study. We had people on the line for probably 12, 13 minutes or so. People were really good about sitting on the line and asking and answering a lot of questions that we asked them. Final two questions, that majorities of every group agree that it's possible to successfully allow sandhill crane hunting and maintaining sandhill crane viewing opportunities for wildlife watchers, that we actually did see a small majority of people who said, well, we think we could do both. And then also a majority in almost all the groups, except for a couple, the hunt area hunters and the hunt area wildlife watchers, think that both holding the Tennessee Sandhill Crane Festival and allowing hunting is beneficial to the Hiawassee community. That is in terms that you could have both. So I was asked to speak only for a few minutes in terms of our methodology. Very quick rundown in terms of what it is that we saw and what we found. And I think maybe the bigger learning experience will be if you need for me to answer questions in terms of both methodology and anything else. So thanks very much for having me. I'm yours as long as you can stand me up here. So thank you.
Any questions or comments from the commission?
Did you have any data about, or what were the results of the question about having a hunt and a festival? Could you,
Hunt and a festival?
hunt and a festival together?
Yeah, we did, and I'm not sure if there was a majority, but most people felt comfortable with having both, that they weren't mutually exclusive. Very few people said having a hunt only, but in cases there might have been a plurality. I'm not sure if there was a majority, but in most cases it was either the festival or both, but not just hunt only. Good question. Yeah.
Do you think that based on the results you've got, that the more informed the respondents were, the more in favor they were. So if you continued to add whatever the science might be or the recommendations from Fish and Wildlife, whatever, that they would have been more in support of the hunt or not?
We saw movement on both sides, and so it wasn't strong movement, but it was definitely movement. I would say that individuals who gave general population people things that they felt would push them in opposition could work with 5 to 10, maybe 15% of the population, and maybe that much, 10, 15% in support. So in some ways it kind of worked both ways. Good question, and I'm not sure of the long-term communication effects that it would have. We deal with a lot of controversial issues like this. Most recently for the Texas legislature on deer breeding in Texas, which was a controversial issue. And I could say similar things here is that, well, I could say something here and everybody would know. Texas and other places, if I say this, people will look at me strange, but I actually use a Tennessean, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who said, you know, the person who gets there with the, what was it, the firstest with the mostest? Is that correct? And I think that that's true in a lot of these situations, is that you saw the very low knowledge levels. And the people who get to people who are sort of back and forth or don't know a whole lot, or quite frankly that it's not a very high salient issue for, can move people in one direction or the other. So I think that there's some people set in stone about it on both sides, and then there's sort of that middle that can move in one direction or another. So.
Anybody else from the commission?
I'd like to say something. The one figure that, and maybe I wrote it down wrong, but it just said that 76% of the hunters supported once they got more information. Was that correct?
It was probably on one of the attributes. And I can go back and I can double check that for you, but it's probably the one that cranes have increased, that we saw an increase in support for. Again, you're dealing with numbers that, you saw those very low numbers that people thought that cranes were increasing. And so I'm virtually positive we can go back to that.
I just had written that down. I think part of the thing that we're dealing with as a commission is if we weren't on this commission and we didn't live in that area, we probably wouldn't know anything about cranes either. And so my thoughts is that the education of the public, and I read somewhere in the survey that even 35%, I think I read this, 35% of bird watchers in the state did not know what is the difference between a sandhill crane and a blue heron.
Yeah.
And that's
Very
the
low levels of knowledge, you're exactly right.
And so I just, you know, I know that it's disturbing for us to see 45% was all the hunters that said they would be in favor of a hunt. But if the knowledge of that is so low, I'm not even sure the hunters themselves knew what the difference between blue herons and the cranes themselves were. So
Yeah,
that's
great,
just,
great question. One of the things that I could do for you, and I wish I had done it before, but I was on my way down here studying the report again because we did it a couple of months ago. What I'd like to do is run a cross tabulation almost on all of those people and look at that how support changed when people thought that crane populations were increasing versus decreasing. But there's a lot here. I don't want to make it, what I don't want to leave you with is that simple information pushes people one way or the other, because in a lot of ways we're dealing with some deeply seated attitudes as well. And we do see that on a national level, that while the public supports hunting overall, that when it comes to different species or different motivations, that the public shifts, and sometimes they sort of stick right there. For example, if you don't see many referenda against hunting for deer for food, but you see lots of referenda, ballot initiatives maybe on hunting of mourning doves, or hunting of cougar, mountain lion, or hunting for a trophy. So it gets pretty complicated in terms of those variables that people are making their decisions on. Information is absolutely important, but sometimes we're also dealing with very deeply seated attitudes as well.
thank you.
Anyone else from the commission? Anyone from the audience?
Well, I realize I'm going to have an opportunity to speak later, but I do have a question.
Would you state your name, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Melinda Lowe
Thank you.
from Nashville. Has there been a survey about who it is that takes surveys? And this is a 15, oh, thank you. This was a 15-minute survey, and I just wonder if there's a survey about who it is that takes surveys.
Sure. It's a good question, and I'm glad that you asked that. The truth is, as a really good, accurate representation of either the American public or whoever it is that's out there. Sometimes people who don't like the results of surveys will say that very question. Nobody does surveys. Hence my point that if you ask me a week before the presidential election who's going to win that, and I'm within a percentage or two, and the people who take my survey look just like the American public does, as published by the Bureau of the Census, I can tell you what people think about cranes.
I looked at the answers that residents gave and the answers that wildlife watchers gave. When I saw the criterion that put someone in a category of wildlife watcher, it seemed a little loose. Was there a statistical difference between the answers that residents gave and the answers that wildlife watchers gave?
Yeah, good question. We do a lot of work on wildlife viewing, and you're making another good point, and that is it depends, even with hunters, but even more so probably with wildlife viewers, is what constitutes a wildlife viewer. The Fish and Wildlife Service over the years has identified different types of wildlife viewers. People who do it around their home, people who do it away from their home, more than a mile away from their home, people who do it casually versus people who are maybe like some of us, birders, and we can identify hundreds of species. So you're making a good point, but I'm not sure how it is. If we would have said, if we'd have made the criteria, you're only a real birder or a real wildlife watcher if you can identify 100 species or more. You know, is that fair? I've had somebody going, look, I can't identify 100 species, but I love watching wildlife as much as you. So the fact that there were a lot of wildlife viewers, one can say, I think it's about a quarter, 25, 30%. I'll have to go back and see, don't quote me on that one. Goes to the fact that indeed we wanted to make it more inclusive. Otherwise, somebody else would have stood up there and said, I don't like your definition. But we know for a fact that there's a difference between a birder who can identify 100 species versus somebody's looking out of their window and watching a cardinal on their bird feeder. But is that fair to say, oh, you're a real wildlife watcher, but you're really not? So if that's what you're getting at, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think that that influenced the results at all, but I was just wondering if you had done any
Yeah.
statistics to see if there was a
on
difference.
individual questions, certainly
Okay.
be glad to do that in terms of looking at.
It's not that
The
important.
fact- yeah, it's a good point. I'm glad you brought it up because we get asked that a lot. But
Mm-hmm.
there are certainly different groups of wildlife viewers out there, and how you define that is going to certainly define the population that you're talking to. Yeah.
And another thing I may have misunderstood when you were talking is early on in the survey, you said that 60% of Tennessee residents opposed a hunt. And then after the educational questions, that changed to 67% that opposed a hunt. Am I mistaken about that?
That was after giving them information. Remember, after giving information, you saw movement on both ends. You saw increases in people who supported the hunt, and you saw increases in people who opposed the hunt. And that was hence our conversation about information certainly is affecting, 10, 15, 20%, depending on which variable it was.
Okay. Thank you
So
very
good
much.
observation. Thank you. Good questions.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question, if I may. Have you done a similar type of study for Tennessee on other species? And if you haven't, I'm wondering if Ed can answer that. I guess I'm thinking about years ago, in East Tennessee at least, we weren't able to hunt Canada geese. And then it was opened on a very limited basis. We had to have a tag and so forth. And I was just wondering if we had done this type of study with other species, whether you
great
had or
question.
whether we have in the state, generally, and how those compared.
Yeah, great question. I don't have any information specifically in Tennessee, but I absolutely have it on a national level. It's actually in the book that we brought you in the sportsman's base. So,
And I guess one of the reasons for my question is how much of a emotional connection might there be with this particular species as opposed to others?
yeah,
Well,
well,
trying to understand.
it's a great question, and I always go back to Orwell. I guess you're not supposed to do a quote that you don't remember, but remember an Animal Farm that He said that, what was it, help me out here, all animals are created equal, there are just some that are created more equal than others, something to that effect. And that certainly is true with public attitudes. And again, that's why you don't see anti-hunting initiatives against hunting for deer, because 85% of American public, and in every state we've ever done, support hunting for deer. But it's when you start getting down to issues and species like bear, black bear, or mourning dove, or other species that you'll see populations go back and forth like that. And you're exactly right. It's a really good question. And that's what you're dealing with here, is that you don't see any opposition to hunting. People are never going to shut down hunting in Tennessee. It's just not going to happen through a referendum or a ballot initiative, but they might go after different species. And it's pretty predictable, to be perfectly honest with you. Based on our research, we can tell you what it is. In fact, I think you had a right to hunt and fish vote recently, or it was probably right at that 80% level or whatever that was. So these things trail pretty well. And my point about the woman who asked about who does these surveys. Well, Tennessee residents, your neighbors do those surveys. I'm going to call you up next week and ask you a question. So, even if you have a cell phone, you're not. You're not. Yes, this included cell phones as well as landlines. So
Mark, you might
it's a nice,
mention-
accurate representation.
I'm sorry, for Commissioner Ripley, you might mention, you just completed the bear survey for us with somewhat similar questions.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I got one. Just recently in the state of California, didn't they have a similar case where it was mountain lions? Is there any comparisons there? Or what was the focal point of that study or that referendum on mountain lion hunting? I mean, that's obviously a sensitive species and kind of similar to what we're dealing with here today.
It is, and I was not involved with that initiative.
I didn't know
so-
if you had anything to do with.
Yeah, I could find out quite easily, but I would imagine that that's gonna parallel pretty closely what we're finding out. Again, hunting for deer is okay. Hunting for mountain lion and other species, all of a sudden you start splitting opinion. Hunting for food is okay. Hunting for a trophy, all of a sudden you see splits here. So I think that the message here is that you are dealing with emotional issues. You're dealing with a species that people aren't used to hunting, and there's lots of issues around that from both a factual knowledge perspective as well as from an emotional type of situation. I have the really easy job here. You just hire me and I can tell you what people think. You have the very difficult job of making policy on these issues. So somebody once said that science seeks questions, policy demands answers. I've got the easy route here in terms of giving you that information. The difficult job in terms of change is transforming that information to policy decisions.
Any other questions concerning the Sandhill Crane survey?
I started out to ask this because I think I know the answer, but it seemed to me that the hesitancy or of people in favor of a hunt were because perhaps based on the answers that there could be a mistake of a whooping crane killed or that the population wouldn't support it. Is that correct? So, and as they became more comfortable with it, the answers were perhaps more in favor.
You did see an increase in that, and those were the two ones that resonated the most in terms of not to hunt sandhill cranes. That there might be confusion with whooping cranes and sandhill cranes, and that some groups oppose hunting.
But I'd like to say this, when we go to something like that, because there might be some confusion, and I've read statistics of how many cranes that are taken in the United States each year, and what the instance of confusion, and some of those have been taken wrongly, it's very, very low. I think, Gray, you may have those figures, don't you? Will you share those with us later? Thank you. And I just think if the public had known what the incident level is, then there may not have been as much of a change in their attitude as far as not supporting the hunt.
And good point. Again, we worked with a group of people, a consortium of people who helped develop, those factual things. We didn't just kind of make those up. We worked with a group of people who sort of asked us to put it in in that light.
If there's no more comments about the survey, thank you.
We're going to need to take a break for our video, but we certainly appreciate you making the long drive down here to take the time to do that, so we could ask you these questions, and they're pertinent. We appreciate the good job you did with our survey.
Thanks, I appreciate it too, and I'll come down anytime, because that's a beautiful drive, so thanks very much, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks also for the book. It's
Yes,
very nice.
welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.